Darkness gradually engulfed the small town of Whitewood, as if a hungry beast creeping into its streets and homes. The residents felt the cold waves of fear penetrating their souls, but no one knew what awaited them ahead. Whitewood was a quiet and peaceful place where everyone knew each other and considered themselves safe. But with the arrival of autumn, a time came when darkness began to take over the town. People noticed strange sounds at night and visions they could not explain. Fear seeped into every corner of the town like an invisible monster ready to strike. One of the residents of Whitewood was a young writer named Jacob. He was interested in the paranormal and always sought inspiration for his dark stories. But what was happening in his hometown surpassed all his expectations. One night, during his evening walks, Jacob noticed a strange man lurking in the shadows. He was dressed in black and looked terrifying. Jacob decided to follow him to find out what he was doing in the town. Their path led them to an old abandoned building that had once served as a psychiatric hospital. Inside the building, Jacob discovered dark rooms filled with old beds and rusted instruments. The air was filled with the smell of death and madness. He continued to follow the stranger until he saw him in one of the basements. There, in the depths of darkness, was a room filled with books and black candles. The man stood in front of an altar on which lay an open book with unknown symbols. Jacob held his breath, watching him. Suddenly, the stranger turned and saw Jacob. In his eyes burned an inhuman rage, and he began to approach the writer. Jacob tried to run, but his legs refused to obey. He realized that he had fallen into a trap. The stranger began to curse Jacob, uttering unintelligible words in an unknown language. Fiery symbols flared up around them, and the room filled with sinister light. Jacob felt his strength leaving his body and darkness enveloping his consciousness. When Jacob came to his senses, he found himself in a dark and abandoned part of the psychiatric hospital. His body felt weak and battered, and his mind was on the brink of breaking. He looked around and saw that the room he was in was filled with old medical devices, stained with blood and dirt. The walls were covered with mold, and the air was saturated with an atmosphere of fear and madness. Jacob realized that he was trapped, created by a stranger, and that his life was hanging by a thread. He tried to stand up and get out of the room, but his legs wouldn't obey him, as if he were tied to the floor. Suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching the room. He tried to scream for help, but his voice froze in his throat. In the doorway appeared the stranger, the man Jacob had seen in the basement. The stranger smiled with a sinister grin and approached Jacob. He held a sharp object resembling a knife in his hands and slowly approached the writer. Madness and bloodlust burned in his eyes. Jacob realized that his time had come to an end. He closed his eyes and prepared for death, but suddenly he heard a sound like a creaking door opening. In the next moment, a group of police officers burst into the room and arrested the stranger. It turned out that the police had received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity in the abandoned hospital. Thanks to this tip, Jacob was saved from certain death. After the incident in the psychiatric hospital, Jacob decided, use them in your future stories. Thus ended his terrible story, but even after leaving Whitewood, Jacob felt that darkness and fear would always follow him, reminding him that true horrors could hide in the most ordinary places.